Hi, I'm Phil Kurz, a contributing editor for TVTechnology magazine. Thanks for joining us today at the Alt Forward TVB 2020 virtual conference. Our topic is adaptive audience fulfillment, a new approach for television advertising. With us today are Graham Heap and Rob Malcolm. Graham is the Senior Director Product Management at Imagine Communications. For more than a quarter century, Graham has designed and developed media software systems. Currently, he plays a lead role at Imagine, directing product development strategy for its ad tech group. Rob is Chief Marketing Officer at Imagine Communications, where he's responsible for the company's go-to-market strategy across its entire product portfolio. Prior to joining Imagine, Rob was Chief Marketing Officer and VP of Marketing for a publicly traded software as a service provider. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Shall we begin? Let's start off by explaining to the audience what adaptive audience fulfillment is and how it differs from where we are today.
So, Graham, how about you just give a little bit of a background to adaptive audience fulfillment and the history, and then we can take the audience through a diagram, because it is a rather complex topic that is often confused. And so I think a little bit of background and then a diagram would really help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Phil said, as a vendor on the software side for a couple of decades, we've been working in markets all around the world and we'll get into this a little bit later, that have been, doing various forms of audience-based selling. And we've tried to kind of boil that down into what that means in a US context. And I think, we'll walk through how, models are working around the world, how that applies to the US, and what the benefits might be of that approach. So I think if we walk through something that you guys will probably already completely familiar with, which is kind of how the current traditional spot buy, flow goes in the market, and then we'll try and overlap that with a different way of potentially working, and it should be pretty interesting.
Okay. Well, as you can see, we've created a little diagram, and just to familiarize you with what you see on the screen right now, on the left you have obviously the brand or the agency, who are the buyers. In the middle is hopefully you guys who are watching, the broadcaster. And on the right-hand side, we have a fairly rudimentary, description of a number of channels with a number of programs, and inside of each program and in between each program, we have some slots, available inventory for breaks to be inserted. And at the end, on the right-hand side, you obviously have the channels and the transmission stream being broadcast, and you have all of the audience, the families, the men, the women sitting at home watching the TV channels. And so given that you understand advertising at quite some depth, we'll run through the first slide rather quickly. The second slide that we'll show you is how adaptive audience fulfillment differs from this traditional approach. So the first step in the process is a brand or an agency would send in an order to the broadcaster, and typically they would want a guarantee of both the audience and where the ad is going to be placed in the program. So in other words, they want a guaranteed placement and they want guaranteed audience. The second step would be at the time of booking, the broadcaster's systems would typically, look at available spot breaks and would try and figure out where the best place would be to put that spot in order to reach that audience and to fulfill, the request of the advertiser. The third step is using historical and predicted audience. The spot would then be placed, but this is the only time that the spot is placed. If for whatever reason at some later stage another brand and advertiser comes along and they insist that they absolutely have to have that break, then you could have that particular spot being preempted and kicked to another place, or the spot might be cancelled. Graham, before I move on to the next steps, do you want to just highlight anything that I might have missed in my initial description of these first three steps?
No, I think that's fair. I think the key things you mentioned first, which is this kind of dual commitment, both to the destination, but also the journey, right? So it's the volume of audience that they're trying to get and where it must be. And as on the sell side, you really commit to both of those things, which you'll see how, obviously how that plays out, but you guys know how that plays out. But that's going to be one of our key kind of differentiating points when we look at the adaptive model.
All right. So once the ad has been placed in a spot or in a break, at that point it's confirmed back to the brand in the form of a contract. It's basically saying, here is where we're going to put your ad. This is how much it costs. This is the audience you can expect. Then some time goes by, and the real actual ratings or the impacts will come from an agency or other sources that'll say exactly how many people of which demo actually watched the ad. And at that point, the systems will have to determine whether or not the contract is fulfilled. And in many cases, the contract is not fulfilled, either because the predicted audience is not what it was meant to be, or there may have been some preemption that happened earlier on. And so in that situation, what typically happens, what typically happens is that there's a make good. And this overall process and the need for a make good is obviously fairly complex because predicting audience is obviously something that's pretty challenging to do. Should we move on, Graham? Anything else that you can think of?
No, I think we're good.
All right. So this is where adaptive audience fulfillment differs from traditional spot booking, is that when a brand or an agency places an ad, the broadcaster says, well, I can't guarantee where I'm going to put the ad unless it's a really premium placement, like it's a spot in the Super Bowl or some real premium break. Typically, the broadcaster would say to the agency or brand, I can guarantee the audience, but I can't guarantee exactly where I'm going to put the ad. So at that point, a confirmation after the order is put in is sent back to the brand, but it's only guaranteeing the audience. It's not guaranteeing the spot where the ad is placed. Then at this point, this is where the magic happens. An adaptive audience fulfillment system would then look at all of the programs, look at all of the available inventory, but it wouldn't be looking at it from a spot-by-spot standpoint. It's effectively a bit of a washing machine, if you will, that happens every single day. So all of the available inventory would be put into this washing machine. The system would then basically take a look at all of the ratings, all of the audience, all of the available inventory fundamentally, and it would do a preliminary booking of that spot in a break. And at that point, it would be temporarily filled, if you will. But this is something that goes on and on every single day, hence the name adaptive audience. And the beauty of this is, as ratings and as real world circumstances change, where the ad is placed is fundamentally changed. And that way you get this optimization of inventory, optimization of audience. Graham, this is your speciality, so feel free to add lots of color.
No, that's exactly right. I think the key is everything, because the idea of needing to use the washing machine every day is because things change every day, right? And something needs to happen. That might be supply changes, and changes to your audience predictions. It might be demand changes, new orders arriving. So the whole supply and demand mix is constantly moving, and therefore the placements and decisions I made yesterday about where an ad should be are not necessarily where now today with all my new data in hand is not necessarily the optimal place for that thing to be fulfilled. So the adaptive part of this comes in reacting to those real world changes that happen on an ongoing basis. Typically it's daily, because that's the cadence of data that's coming from my measurement sources. It doesn't have to be daily. It could be faster than that if you're working with data sources that are inherently faster than our kind of Nielsen Comscore kind of daily routine. But we're talking about it in daily terms because we're talking about linear TV as measured by panels, right? So that's really the key to it. It's having having the systems, and not people, having the systems react to that changing on a constant basis to prop up the efficiency and the delivery that's going on. And then ultimately that turns into a happy customer at the end of the day. They haven't necessarily been given a commitment to where the spots are, but the machine is working constantly towards the end date on the order to fulfill the audience. And that's all done automatically and hands off.
Right.
So rather maybe controversially that, there is no such thing as a make good in this model. There is no displaced units because every unit is displaceable to an extent within the boundaries of what the campaign can accept. Every unit is movable, so it gets moved. It may get moved, and that's the kind of beauty of the model that it can adapt and optimize on an ongoing basis.
Exactly. So just finishing off the slides here, obviously the actual ratings and impacts would be coming in, like Graham said, on a daily basis. And the washing machine and the algorithm effectively would be using that to try and figure out whether or not the system was on track to meeting the contractual requirement based on the audience order, or whether things need to move around. And the system will just keep on optimizing until the order is fundamentally fulfilled. So as Graham said, the real advantage here is that the system just optimizes until the contract's fulfilled, and so therefore there's no make goods and no displaced spots. I think that's probably a good description of what we're talking about. Hopefully you found that helpful. It's probably worthwhile just spending 1 minute before we move on to the next question to just explain how this name, adaptive audience fulfillment, is something that we at Imagine have essentially crafted simply because, in our experience, there isn't a name that is unilaterally used when talking about this concept. A lot of people would say it's selling on audience, but then the word audience is sometimes used in confusing ways when actually they think about impressions and audience as the same thing. Whereas this is different to the currency, right, Graham? I mean, the currency fundamentally doesn't matter. The adaptive audience fulfillment is more of a process or a way of selling and fulfilling ads.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because it's not true to say the US doesn't do audience-based sales, right? It does. It's using it in a different model. So the addition of the word adaptive kind of brings in the key piece here, which is the bit that's always missing when people say I'm in an audience-based market. Well, that's fine, but you could be in an audience-based market and do everything by hand, and have people placing spots and being measured on audience. The trick here is that it's machine-led and it's adaptive. So we've tried to coin a phrase that kind of differentiates itself from just audience-based sales, because that can mean so many things to different people. If that makes sense.
Rob and Graham, you're both in the UK. How is adaptive audience fulfillment being used around the world, and why is it relevant to the US market?
So the UK is an example, but many markets around the world are trading on an adaptive audience basis or a guaranteed audience basis. And some have just been trading on audience and have started to introduce this idea of automation and the adaptive element to it. Some markets have been doing it for decades. The UK, Scandinavia, have been in the ratings trading market and automated booking methodology for a long time. Other markets, emerging markets, South Africa is an example. Australia is a great example. That have been in a spot trading model for a long time, and just in the last kind of 3 to 5 years have started to adapt to the way they trade with their buyers. And have introduced adaptive audience trading in and alongside their spot-based business. So that brings us to the sort of applicability to the US, right? It's true that the methods of distribution and ad insertion, the capabilities in that respect have moved on, substantially. I think it's fair to say though that the monetization capabilities and the trading methods that have been used haven't really moved that far. And you could argue that the ad sales methodologies have lagged behind the delivery capabilities. I think that's fair. Now we all know TV is the best place to find a kind of an emotional connect, to connect your buyer to your viewer in a brand safe, emotionally powerful relationship, right? So TV has those strengths, and what it does struggle with is the kind of the cost of the cost of trading, both on the buy side and the sell side, the amount of effort, manpower, and cost, and people, frankly, that are making that happen and bringing that money in, probably could do with a look at. So we think the applicability is it has a very valuable proposition in the US. Rob talked earlier about the idea of make goods and displaced units, and the angst and the frustration that lives around those. I like to call it the make good tax, right? The US market is paying the make good tax. And I think that bringing in elements of adaptive audience fulfillment will start to lessen the burden of that tax to the business, so that TV as a whole, can strengthen itself. I think it's a really exciting time. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think what we are seeing is more and more broadcasters around the world wanting to move to this model. And I think that that's driven by a combination of pressure to reduce complexity and costs. Like you said, Graham, if you have 1,000 people in your operations today, you can reduce that number substantially by adopting and selling advertising in this way. But I think the other thing that's driving it is the brand and the agencies, although they're used to, particularly in North America, buying television advertising in a different way. Adaptive audience fulfillment is very similar to digital, where there is no concept of a spot, right? There's just a concept of an audience. And so, if anybody is trying to figure out where the world is going in terms of a hybrid linear and digital world, it looks very similar to what digital looks like today, and adaptive audience fulfillment for linear in the future.
Yeah.
So this sounds like a big transition from the norm. Has there been a pushback from the agency community in other countries or anywhere else where agencies are involved?
I think it's fair to say there's always a fear factor. There's always a look, we've worked this way, it works. It's not like the systems are fundamentally broken. TV spots are going to air. Station broadcasters and other sort of media sellers are making money, so it's not fundamentally broken. So there is always going to be a resistance to a big change, which is completely understandable, completely normal. And in those other markets I talked about, it's not like they've switched a light switch and moved from one model to another and overnight changed the way they do business. So there has been resistance, but it's usually kind of tackled with firstly modeling and talking about the model, because it's actually fundamentally good for both the buyer and the seller. This isn't, obviously we sell our software to the sell side, but frankly, if you look at the bigger picture in terms of the health of the ad sales markets, it's good for both the buyer and the seller. It's good for TV overall. So working through that with your customers, running proof of concepts, doing trials, running parallel, hybrid models between spot-based sales and what that would look like in an adaptive model. There's lots of tactics and techniques that can be used to sort of work through that. And then the resistance goes because both sides can see the benefits. They can certainly see the cost saving benefits. Those are really easy to read. But then they start to see the kind of other broader benefits that come with it too.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Graham said, there have been broadcasters in recent years who have moved from 100% spot-based line booking type methods to literally getting to 50% sales on audience versus 50% in a traditional model. And so the key point that I would make is that it's not one or the other. It's definitely a transition. It's an evolution. And as long as the agencies and the brands understand that, then I think the proof is in the pudding. You start small. Yeah. You start demonstrating to your customers that this is not going to impact their value for money and their ROI, if you will. And as soon as you do that, then it becomes much easier.
So, how does adaptive audience fulfillment accommodate premium advertising slots, such as the Super Bowl, for instance, so the broadcasters can continue to demand top dollar?
It's kind of an interesting one. Obviously, if I put my purist hat on, I'd argue that cherry picking, whether it be into premium or super premium, is unhealthy. But I do have to put that to one side because there's an emotional connection to those events. There's prices that you wouldn't that don't relate really to the audience. They relate to the prestige of the spot that's being placed. So, really, two ways of handling that in the model. Either you accept that it's hybrid, and I'm just going to treat those in a handcrafted, hand placed, spot based model, and I'm just going to charge whatever I charge. The other way is to actually include them in the model and use basically variable cost per points and cost per impressions that reflect the value of that programming. So in the UK, they do exactly that. We have our football, soccer, as you would have it, which does carry a much heavier weight than the audience that it really brings. Right, the money brought in for that is just at a substantially higher level, and that's done using these variable costs. So you're buying an adult 16 to 34 in the news every evening comes at a different cost per impact or cost per point than buying the Sunday football, which carries this premium tag on it. So really, those two ways to handle that.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize or re-emphasize, we're not proposing with adaptive audience fulfillment that premium spots are ever going to go away. There is always going to be some element of inventory that requires an audience and a placement guarantee, and that's okay. All we're saying is get to a healthier balance, which ultimately justifies the operational overhead and the complexity that spot and line booking methods carry. Right. So if you're charging a premium, sure, sell it in a much more expensive way, but sell 70 to 80% of your inventory in a much more efficient way, and that's what adaptive audience fulfillment, I think, brings to the equation.
So, do you envision this making a successful move to adaptive audience fulfillment being more like a flash cut or a gradual journey, and why?
I mean, it's a journey. It's proven that it needs to be a journey. No markets, particularly something as substantial as the US market, can attempt this in a big bang fashion, is my view. I mean, good if you're brave, but frankly, I don't think the market would survive the earthquake. So it needs to be a journey, and that journey can take time, and depending on the imperatives, particularly the advent of cross-platform and other things that we'll talk about, it might be that you want to take that journey quickly. But as Rob said, it's about introducing it as an item on your menu and then growing that piece of the business and moving in that direction, and how fast you choose to do that. If you're successful and you want to do it fast, great, but always have the options open. That's really our advice.
Yeah, and I think some broadcasters will have channels or spots that have very low audience numbers today, and they may have a challenge selling those spots. They're 3 a.m. spots when seemingly nobody's watching, right? You can pull all of that type of inventory that you struggle to sell into this model, and that's the perfect starting point, in my view, of a way of being able to sell that audience, as small as it might be. But it's much easier to sell it in an adaptive audience fulfillment way, for those kinds of inventory.
Do you have an example of a broadcaster that's made the transition, and what was their experience?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a number of examples. I think the most recent one, in fact, I think we just posted an article on this, was Nine in Australia, who around about 2 years ago, made a decision that they needed to move to an audience-based model. They were looking at a broadening base of markets they were addressing, number of channels that they were trying to push out, and number of platforms that they were introducing to the market. and they looked at what that was going to do if they just extrapolated their current spot-based model, and they looked and they kind of started to sweat on the numbers and decided that actually trying to automate this and trying to introduce a guaranteed audience cell was a necessary way to support that business growth, which they then went and did. And some 2 years later, they're nearing, I forget the numbers, Rob, I think you might have them. They're certainly more than 35% now sold on audience, marching towards 50% pretty quickly. And that's really become part of a market move. The whole of Australia is kind of starting to lean in the same direction. So it's gained momentum. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and there's obviously many other customers, some of which we can't mention by name for confidentiality reasons, but we are certainly seeing a much faster uptake in this model due to the reasons we discussed earlier. So.
Great, thank you. Broadcasters are looking for an effective way to sell Broadcasters are looking for an effective way to sell cross-platform. In other words, their linear TV product as well as their digital platforms. Is there a cross-platform synergy to selling adaptive audience fulfillment?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I think just getting the TV buyers attuned to the idea of audience being the commitment and being the thing that I'm buying is absolutely the bridge to cross-platform sales, and the adaptive model then just extends over that. If you look at what's happening in the UK, who've been in the adaptive model for a while, and now as of this fall, we'll be selling cross-platform audience-based campaigns and orders. And that's just an extension on the adaptive model, because, okay, I'm optimizing my linear TV to deliver my linear audience and do that on an audience basis. What I'm now doing is I'm adding a commitment, and I can go and find that audience on my VOD platform, on my OTT streaming platform, and ultimately my addressable platform. So my technology to do ad insertions, which things like ATSC3 is gonna bring into play, means that the adaptive model can then, still on an audience basis, start to bridge out and cover, give coverage in those areas as well. So I think it's absolutely part of that journey.
Yeah, the way that we think about it is adaptive audience fulfillment is the bridge to selling cross-platform, and that's simply because like I said before, the world of digital has no concept of a spot, right? So when you're watching a VOD program at home, and you see a couple of pre-roll ads, that doesn't work in a traditional line booking spot placement type world. And so if you start working on audience and eyeballs and impressions, and you start optimizing that audience using adaptive audience fulfillment, then the vision fundamentally for television broadcasters, in my view, is it should not matter to the brand or the agency whether my ad is placed in a break at 3 a.m. or whether my ad is placed on a pre-roll on every single person in the audience watching a Game of Thrones on demand. It shouldn't matter, because the audience is the audience, and as long as it adds up to the amount of audience that I'm paying for, and I'm getting an ROI as a marketer, then it shouldn't matter. So for us, adaptive audience is the perfect bridge to getting linear, VOD, addressable, and fundamentally digital, all sold in a very similar manner, and ideally in the same currency.
All right, very good. Graham Heap and Rob Malcolm, thank you for sharing your perspective on adaptive audience fulfillment and its potential to benefit TV broadcasters, brands, and ad agencies. Let me remind you that the Alt Forward virtual conference offers a rich program of sessions, thought leader forums, and award presentations. I encourage you to check them out. Thank you for attending today's session. Good luck and goodbye.